In this tutorial, we will cover chapter 5 that talks about using JSON to communicate between frontend and controller. More precisely, we will be covering these first few tutorials that also show how to use request body annotation to deserialize JSON into DTO. So let's start by describing the general approach when a JSON is being used to communicate between front-end and back-end. This type of communication is shown on this schema. So front-end, let's say that front-end is implemented by using JavaScript. First creates its own DTO as a JavaScript object, and this is an example of such a JavaScript object which represents a person with a name and age. Now, if a front-end wants to send this JavaScript object, this DTO, to our backend, to our controller, what first needs to do is to serialize that object into the JSON string, so that this string can be then transferred over the network to our backend controller. And this is how such a string would look like for this type of DTO. Once this string reaches our backend controller inside the body of the HTTP request, our controller will need to deserialize this JSON string into a Java DTO object, data transfer object. And in our example, such a Java object DTO would look like this. Controller will then usually forward this DTO to the service layer, and when service layer is done calculating business logic, it will return DTO of its own. In our case, let's assume that our service logic again returns a person DTO. So controller would receive such DTO Java object, and in order to send it back to the front end, it needs to serialize this object into JSON string, so that this string can be transferred over the network back to the front end. When this JSON string reaches the front end will then have to deserialize this JSON string back into the Java object, JavaScript DTO object shown here. So in both cases, when DTO needs to be sent over the network, it needs to be serialized from an object into the string. So both front-end needs to serialize DTO when sending DTO to the controller, and the controller needs to serialize its own DTO in order to send it back to the front-end over the network. And also in both cases, when DTO reaches its destination, it needs to be deserialized from a string into the object, both on the backend side in the controller and on the front-end side where JSON string needs to be deserialized, in this case into JavaScript object. So serialization is used to transfer DTOs over the network to the other side, and deserialization is used when such a string reaches its destination, and then deserialization is used to convert such a string into an object so that application can work with it. Our backend application can then work with these JSONs as Java objects, and frontend can work with these JSONs as JavaScript objects. So here, this is defined here. What is deserialization and serialization? So to deserialize means to convert a JSON string into DTO object, and to serialize means to convert DTO object into JSON string. Now, JSON does not need to be used in both directions. For instance, frontend can execute HTTP GET request with request parameters instead of sending JSON, and then backend might return JSON. Or frontend might use HTTP post request and then we use JSON inside its body, and then backend might return HTML page or string, or as we have described in a schema below, both frontend and backend can work with the JSON strings. Also, the JSON that is being sent by the frontend doesn't have to be the same as the JSON that is being returned by the controller. So frontend can send the request JSON and controller can return response JSON. For instance, such request JSON might contain only ID of the person, and then controller might return response JSON with the data of the person with that ID. But for the simplicity in our schema, we were using the same DTO on both ends. That is, the DTO and our JSON had the same properties both when frontend was sending this DTO to the backend and when backend was returning this DTO back to the frontend. Now, by default, Spring Framework uses a JSON library to perform serialization and deserialization between JSON and DTO. And it uses reflection to access properties, get setters, getters, and constructor and it can access them even if they are being private. Now, when deserializing JSON, that is when converting JSON string to DTO object, JSON will use constructors, setters, and property in this order under these priorities. This means that is, if DTO object has a constructor, then that constructor will be used to populate properties of the DTO. If setters exist but there is no constructor, then setters will be used to create a DTO object from JSON string. And if neither setters or constructor exists, then JSON library will use properties and then place values in those properties directly. During serialization of DTO into JSON, JSON will use getters as a higher priority. So if getters are present, it will use getters to get values properties from DTO and create a JSON string. But if getters are not present, then JSON library will use properties and access them directly using reflection, even if those properties are private, and then use values from those properties to create a JSON string. While working with JSON serialization and deserialization, you can use a following annotations. So JSON property is used to map JSON properties with DTO object properties if they don't have the same names. In our case, they do have the same name, so we didn't have to use JSON property annotation, but otherwise we can define the mapping by using JSON property annotation. We can also use JSON format annotation to tell Spring in which format JSON property is, so that that value can be properly transferred between JSON property and DTO property. This can be used, for instance, if one of our JSON properties is, let's say, a date, so that this date can be properly converted in a proper Java date object. So this was an overview of how to work with JSON, deserialization and serialization. Now we will go through specific tutorials that cover each of these topics separately. So let's start by showing how to use request body to Okay, so now we will go to cover chapter 5.1, which talks about deserialization. That means to deserialize JSON string request into request DTO, into a DTO object. To do so, we need to use request body annotation inside our endpoint. So this is the only input parameter that we would need for our endpoint. As mentioned before, during deserialization, we can use these two annotations to either map properties between JSON and DTO or to specify which format is used inside the JSON string so that it can be properly converted into equivalent Java format. When during deserialization, as previously noted, constructor will be used if present. If not, then setters will be used. If neither constructor or setters exist inside DTO, then JSON library will use properties. Now we will show how to use request body to deserialize JSON string directly into the properties of the DTO. So in this case, this is the JSON that we will send to our controller by using Postman, and this is the DTO in which we want those JSON parameters to be automatically loaded. As seen here, our DTO only has properties, so JSON library will use these JSON properties and it will automatically load them directly into our DTO properties. This is done inside the controller by simply using this as input parameter to our endpoint. So we simply use request body annotation to tell Spring Framework that the JSON from a HTTP request body should be automatically loaded into this object of this class, our DTO. This means that inside the endpoint we can already use person DTO because it will be populated with the values from the JSON string. So JSON library will automatically map properties with the same name and use those names to populate equivalent properties, which is why we can then return this from our endpoint. So if we start, so in order to test our application, we can use Postman to create a post request with this URL, and inside the body of the URL we will specify a JSON string. So this is where you select the post, or in this case you can also select get. This is where you define the string, the URL to our endpoint. By selecting this tab body, you can then specify the body of your HTTP request. In our case, this is a JSON string. And when you press send, we will get following response from our controller as being constructed here from our person DTO, which was automatically loaded by Spring Framework from the JSON string properties. We will now show how to use the same approach and request body annotation when DTO contains setters. So in a previous example, our DTO only contained properties, but in this example, it will also contain setters. So if Jackson sees that the DTO has setters, it will then use those setters to load JSON properties instead of loading them directly into the properties as was done in the previous example. Again, it will match setters and JSON properties with the same name to know which setter needs to be called for which JSON property. So the only thing that we have added to our DTO compared to a previous example are these two setters, which are then used to set these properties. Our controller remains the same. Our endpoint has this as a single input parameter, which will automatically load JSON values into the person DTO properties so that we can display the values. The way we test this application is also exactly the same as in a previous example. We can use Postman to create a post HTTP request to this endpoint by using this JSON string inside the body of the request, and we will get the same response as in the previous example. We will now show how to do the same when DTO has a constructor. Remember that the constructor has the highest priority, so if DTO contains constructor, then this constructor will be used to deserialize JSON string, to map JSON string properties into DTO properties. So our person DTO in this case looks like this. Beside the properties, we now have a additional constructor, and Jackson will then use this constructor to load properties from the JSON. Again, it will map constructor parameters with parameters JSON properties in order to load value in appropriate places, and then inside the constructor we can set our properties. Our controller remains the same. We define a single input parameter into our endpoint as a person DTO, and then we can access properties of DTO that has been loaded by Jackson from the JSON string. And again, we can test our application in exactly the same way as in the two previous examples by using Postman to call following URL with this JSON string as a body and then pressing send. And you will get the same result as in the previous two examples. In this example that follows, we will again use constructor, but this time our constructor will do some type of conversion before storing the value into DTO property. In this case, our JSON will have following value for the height, which cannot be directly loaded into DTO float because float expects values to have dot. This means that we have to convert this string by replacing comma with dot before storing this value into our property. And we will do this inside our constructor by calling this converter method that does the conversion and then stores the value into float. So instead of simply storing height equals height into height property, we are calling converter, which will first convert this string by replacing a comma with dot, create float with that new string, and then use this float to set this float property with proper value. Our controller again looks the same as in a previous example. And inside the controller we are now able to access these DTO properties. So the only difference is this additional method that is doing some kind of conversion before storing the value from JSON into the DTO property. In this example, we will demonstrate the order of use of constructor setters and properties by Jackson, because as we have already said, Jackson will use constructor for this serialization if it is present. If not, then it will look for setters, and if neither are present, only then it will use the properties. So we will now have a person DTO that has both properties, setters, and constructor, and in order to confirm which is actually being used, our setter will append this string to a name, and our constructor will append this string to a name. So if our name ends up being like this, then we know that setter is being used, and if our name ends up being set like this, then we know that constructor is being used. Our controller remains the same as in all of the previous examples. Our endpoint has a single input parameter, person DTO, and inside the endpoint we can use properties of that DTO. We will use again Postman to send a post request to our endpoint with this JSON string in the body. Now, if we keep this DTO as shown here, then Jackson will use constructor to load the properties from the JSON string, because we have said that the constructor has the highest priority compared to setters and properties, and therefore our name should end up having constructor as suffix as defined here. So if you use Postman to send this request, then we will have this response confirming that constructor has been used, even though there are both setters and properties present. Now, if we delete constructor from our DTO and then send request again, then we will see that the setters will be used, and we can confirm that by seeing that our name will have this suffix. So if we delete constructor from our DTO and send another post request through Postman, we will see that we will get a following reply, which means that the setters has been indeed used to do this serialization. And as a final test, we can delete both setters and constructor and only leave the property, and then use Postman to send another post request. If we do that, we will see that the JSON values have been directly loaded into properties. That is, the Jackson library will use then properties to load the values when there are no setters or constructor. And this confirms the order in which Jackson is using constructor, setters, and properties in order to load JSON string into the properties. If constructor is present, it will be used. If not, its setters will be used. If they are also not present, only then properties will be used directly. And we will end this tutorial with this video by covering these two tutorials that show how to deserialize JSON array, because in previous tutorials we were deserializing a single JSON object, but here we will have a list of objects, array of objects. This is one JSON object and this is another JSON object, and this indicates that we have array of multiple JSON objects. So our person DTO will only have properties in order to keep it simple, although we could also have setters or constructor as in previous examples. Now, in order to load this array of JSON objects, our endpoint will again have a single input parameter, but this time instead of specifying a name of the object, we will specify that we expect the list of such objects. And this is everything that we need to do compared to the previous example. So in previous examples, we were specifying that the input parameter into our endpoint is DTO object, but here we specify that the input parameter is a list of such DTO objects. And once this list is loaded by Spring Framework, when it gets the HTTP request, this is how we can iterate through the list and get access to each of the DTOs within the list and then get its properties. So if we use Postman to send this URL to our endpoint with this JSON array of objects, we will get following response from the controller, which was able to iterate through all the objects, get its values, and then construct these strings. So in this example, our front end, in this case Postman, was sending an array of JSON objects. The possible problem with this approach is that this array itself is not a JSON object. And if we want to be consistent in a way that communication between front end and the back end is always done through JSON objects, then what we can do is shown in the next tutorial. So instead of sending a simple array of JSON objects, we are here sending a JSON object which has a list of other JSON objects. So in this case, the JSON object that we are sending is author DTO that contains author name, age, and all the books created by the author. And then this books property is actually array of JSON objects. So for that reason, here in this example, we need two DTOs, one DTO that will represent the author object and another DTO that will present a book object from which will be used to create a list. So our DTO objects are defined here. This is our book DTO object that defines title and pages of the book, and as JSON string it will look like this. And this is our author DTO object, which has author name, age, and the list of books that this author was created. These are these DTOs. Now our controller remains as simple as in previous example by having a single input parameter represented by the author DTO object. Now JSON library will use this JSON to automatically create our author DTO object and multiple book DTO objects, since here we have two books inside the list. And all of this will be done automatically so that our controller simply receives author DTO that will already contain the list of books as defined with this JSON string. This means that inside the controller we can access name, age, and books. We can iterate through the books and give some results. Again, this application can be tested by using Postman, which sends post request to this endpoint. And inside the body, we can define our JSON string that contains the list of books, array of JSON objects. And our application will then display the properties of the author, Jack wrote following books, and the properties of each of the books, as we did in the controller here by constructing this result that will be returned by the controller. And this is how our application will look like. We will have a single controllers package with a single controller, and then a DTO package with our two DTOs. No additional dependencies are needed because JSON library is used by default included in the job. So in this video, we have covered these few first tutorials that show how to use request body annotation to deserialize JSON string into DTO by either using properties, setters, or constructor, and how to use the same when we have JSON array of multiple JSON objects instead of just a single JSON object.